I am, so the meeting just started recording. I don't know if y'all heard that or not. But today we're going to be recording the first 30 or 40 minutes or so when we're talking to Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Max Liboiron. And then for the Q&A section, the last 20 minutes or so, that will not be recorded. Anyway, so my name is Jasleena. I'm one of the board members on Sustainable Seattle, for Sustainable Seattle. I will be speaking today, and Jamilah Williams, she is also a board member on S2, Sustainable Seattle, and she will be typing in the chat. So y'all can type in the chat today. And let me just get started with a land acknowledgement. Today, we're coming together from places far across Turtle Island and beyond. Many of us are guests to the land on which we live and work. I am speaking to you from unceded Indigenous land belonging to Coast Salish peoples, and wish to thank and acknowledge the Duwamish peoples who cared for this land since time immemorial and continue to care for it today. We encourage you to contribute to Real Rent Duwamish. Jamilah will be dropping that link in the chat. It's www.realrentduwamish.org. We invite you to share your acknowledgement for the land you are joining from today in the chat. If you don't know yet on whose land you reside, please use the resource Jamilah is about to put in the chat, and that is native-land.ca. It's a pretty cool map. It helped me learn the land I was on, the Indigenous land I was on. Okay, in addition to this acknowledgement, we own that many of us have much to do in learning, understanding, and carrying out the original instructions cultivated by Indigenous peoples who govern Turtle Island sustainably since time immemorial, and who continue to model and advocate for sustainable practices today. The knowledge and lessons that will be shared and discussed today may be considered part of the long process of learning and building right relationships with one another and with Indigenous teaching. Oh, that's awesome. You guys are dropping some of those names in the chat. That's awesome. Anyway, okay. The subtitle of Jessica Hernandez book, Fresh Banana Leaves, talks about healing through Indigenous knowledge. With this in mind, we want to invite this as a community space, a learning space, and a space for growth. We are here to connect with the knowledge and ideas put forth by the speakers and themes in the books. The expectation is that this is a listening space, not a debate space. So we will not tolerate comments that are antagonistic or dishonoring the cultural frameworks presented here today. If we see that in the chat, you will be removed by the moderator. And if that is to occur, we warmly invite you to engage with these ideas and themes by watching the recording. And as I said at the very beginning, the discussion will be recorded for about first 30 or 40 minutes or so, and the Q&A at the end will not be. And I did briefly introduce myself and Jamilah at the beginning, but today's discussion is formally convened by Sustainable Seattle, where I, Jamilah, and Dr. Jessica Hernandez sit on the board of directors. And you can visit our website on sustainableseattle.org. This event and its recording is free to all. Any donations will go in entirety to a fund set up by Dr. Hernandez to support Indigenous-led programming that is free to the public. And that S2 Indigenous Fund you can donate to, Jamilah has the link. It's a short bit.ly link that you can follow, and she'll be dropping that in the chat. Sustainable Seattle is a community-based organization. So a little bit about us: we define sustainability as the ancient and enduring practice of creating richness in natural resources, attuning to nature's environmental indicators, and providing equitable access to health, food, shelter, and economic wealth for all people. We envision a thriving, regenerative, sustainable Seattle, which centers reciprocity, liberation, and restored abundance. To do this, we both work directly with community organizers on the front lines of our region, working to both meet immediate needs of our community members impacted by environmental degradation, and working alongside others to address systemic long-term change in the form of transformational, visionary initiatives and policy. And thank you also to Culture Shift Consulting, who provided our meeting platform today. And you can check them out on cultureshiftconsult.com. Oh, I just see that one of my old professors is in this meeting. So that's very exciting. I'm going to try. Sometimes I can't multitask, so I'll be more focused on speaking than what's in the chat. But Jamilah will be moderating that today. Okay, so let me introduce the speakers. Dr. Jessica Hernandez joined us on the board of directors for S2 last spring. She is a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. She has an interdisciplinary academic background ranging from marine sciences to forestry. Her work is grounded in her Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. She advocates for food, climate, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work, and strongly believes that Indigenous sciences can heal our Indigenous lands. Her book that we'll be talking about today, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, was #1 in Indigenous Studies, Climatology, and Conservation in its first week. So welcome, Dr. Hernandez. And there's some links you can follow to get some more information on who she is on her website, www.jessicabhernandez.com. And also you can check her out on Penguin Random House. So Jamilah has those links that she'll be dropping in the chat. And we're also joined by Dr. Max Liboiron. Dr. Liboiron is a leader in both developing and promoting anti-colonial research methods into a wide array of disciplines and spaces. As a founder of CLEAR, so that is the acronym CLEAR, an interdisciplinary plastic pollution laboratory whose methods foreground humility and good land relations, they have influenced national policy on both plastics and Indigenous research, invented technologies and protocols for community monitoring of plastics, and created protocols for fostering research collectives. They are Red River, and I'm not sure how to say it, Dr. Liboiron, Métis?
Yeah, it's just Métis. It's not so fancy.
Métis, raised in Lac La Biche, Treaty 6 territory. I've been studying French on Duolingo, everyone, so my French words are hopefully sounding good today. And you can check them out on their website, maxliboiron.com. Last name is spelled Liboiron. Also on Duke University Press and on civiclaboratory.nl. And Jamilah has those links once again. She'll be dropping those in the chat. So this is exciting today. I want to get straight into the questions. Jamilah, is there anything, I introduced myself, you're moderating the chat. Is there anything you want to say about yourself before I get into the questions?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Yep. Okay, so my first question is for Dr. Hernandez. I read through your book, and from the first go, I had noticed that what I was reading was nonfiction. It was informational, but it was also very autobiographical. And so in the book, one of my first thoughts was, what's behind the title? And you were already a few steps ahead. And in the book, you actually acknowledge that you get asked about that title a lot, quite a lot, Fresh Banana Leaves. And you contextualize that with a story of your father that weaves throughout the book. A tender story, one of pain, and really witnessing your father in that special way. And so I want to know more about your personal relationship with the banana tree and its leaves. I really got into that narrative that you were having with you and your father. And I also want to know, why is that banana tree special to you, and what emotions and memories does the banana tree and the leaves evoke in you? I just want to follow that up with, in your trailer, it's a very pretty trailer for the premiere of the book, and it's all banana leaves. And so I've given that link to Jamilah, and she'll drop it in the chat. You can watch it on YouTube. It's like 30 seconds. And so my question is, why is that symbol is really powerful? Why is it special to you?
So Bundeo Padichi Biguri, as just Lena mentioned, I'm Dr. Jessica Hernandez, and it's an honor to be here. And thank you, Sustainable Seattle, for hosting us. So thank you for your first question. I think one of the premises for me entitling the book Fresh Banana Leaves is because, of my father's story. I wanted his story to be the foundation of this book, especially given that he encountered something that, for Indigenous peoples, people think that it's kind of contained in the past, and that is the genocide, right? In the Central American Civil War, the United Nations have coined that as a genocide against Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous Maya peoples, because it actually harmed us, right? It was actually persecuting us as Indigenous peoples, trying to go against the oppressive government that was selling our land to these international agricultural corporations that were introducing the monocultural farming, which, an example is the banana plantations. So he recounts the story of when he was 11, he was forced to either join the army or the guerrilla. And, as an Indigenous child, he decided to join the guerrilla, which was the opposing forces against the government. So at the age of 14, he saw his guerrilla encampment bombarded. So obviously that was a gruesome scene for a child, especially, children, to witness during that time frame. And there was always this banana tree that he will kind of saw as his relative, that he kind of played with, that he saw as his refuge, especially from the harsh realities that he was enduring as a child. My father didn't see himself any longer as a child when I asked him that question, because he's like, oh, I've been through life in this, in this case, war, the loss of his father, my grandfather, at a young age. So he didn't see himself as a child, but he was 14. So when he saw the bombs kind of dropping on the Igria encampment, he decided to kind of go seek refuge in this banana tree that he had made his friend. And one of the things that, is kind of hard to explain, especially in Western, colonial languages, whether that be Spanish for us or English that we're speaking today, the leaves kind of wrapped the bomb in a way that it prevented it from igniting, right? And that obviously is something that can be seen like as a dream or something, especially when we're trying to explain it in Western languages. But for my father, it was, that relationship that nature protects you as long as you protect nature. And he had protected this tree, and this tree had protected him as a child, right? Going through that, gruesome reality that he was enduring, which was war. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much for your answer. It sounds like it's a profound story of pain and protection, and one that you understand to a deep depth that you understand deeply. So thank you so much for that answer. My next, oh, actually, excuse me. So I didn't even give you a chance to introduce yourself, Dr. Hernandez. So thank you for doing that. Before I go into asking Dr. Liboiron their question, how do you want to introduce yourself, doctor?
Oh, sure. Tanche, Max Liboiron, Dijnekashun, Laklibishtischen, Nikiamiti Nation. I'm Dr. Max Liboiron. I'm Mitcha for Red River Métis. Originally grew up in Treaty 6 territory, but my family, the Turners, the Umpervilles, and the Woodmen, are from Manitoba. Thanks for inviting me. Oh, and for allowing me to introduce myself.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that that went over my head, Dr. Hernandez. Okay, so thank you both so much for being here. My next question is for you. One of the I noticed that earlier on with Dr. Hernandez, I noticed that story of your father early on, and then something in your book, Pollution is Colonialism, that I noticed early on. One of the earliest sentences that struck me was that while colonialism is certainly bad, that word colonialism isn't synonymous for bad. And that struck me because I hadn't quite thought of that word like that before. I think for me, I did equate it with bad. Um, and the actual title is Pollution is Colonialism. So just through that title and that early sentence, I think the reader knows that we're going to get a lot of nuanced explanations as to how we use language around the history of land, weather. You talk about how weather is, in fact, not small talk in your book, and oppressive structures. And so my question for you is, why is it important for you to go to this depth in the subjects that you explore in this book? And I'm guessing, I may not be right here, but I'm guessing in your personal life as well, because through your narration, I think I get a sense of how you relate to the world, which is a very penetrating way. And so why is it important for you to go to that depth?
So yeah, good question. So the whole introduction spends a lot of time being like, okay, so colonialism isn't the same as capitalism. Colonialism, anti-colonialism isn't the same as environmentalism, right? So here are the differences between those things. And so yeah, so nuance is really important to the book because the book is a methods text, first and foremost. It talks about how research is a land relation and therefore an ethic. And therefore, when you do things out in the world, you are doing things with, for, on, about land, whether you choose that or not. And it's also very dedicated to, say, activism might be one way to put it, but making change. When you do research, you're also doing action. You're also putting things into the world. And so whether you call that activism or you call it research or you call it going to school or you call it administrating or you call it reading, whatever, it's all methods. And so I've learned from a lot of folks, Eve Tuck, Rick Travoya, lots of other Indigenous people, where one of the things we struggle with a lot when it comes to activism is just being like, oh, colonialism bad, capitalism's bad, patriarchy's bad, it's all bad. So therefore, when I do something good, I'm addressing all the bad things. And what we find a lot, especially in movements where we have a lot of allies that aren't Indigenous or allies that are very differently Indigenous, is that sometimes when you address one set of bads, you completely don't address the others. So for instance, land acknowledgements, I would consider forms of inclusion and being against Indigenous erasure, but they do nothing to land relations. They don't touch genocide, they don't touch land back. And so what happens often, especially in like academic institutions or in these places of power, is that land acknowledgements come to act as if they actually are dealing with land relations, and therefore you don't have to do anything else because you've done the land acknowledgement. You're like, no, that's inclusion, and it's stopping the erasure of Indigenous people, and that is good, but that doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form that you've given land back, which is really what we're asking for. So you don't want to conflate your bads because you don't want to conflate your goods, because you want to be really specific about those things when you're actually trying to change them. And actually, one of the texts that Dr. Hernandez also talks about in her book is Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. And they wrote that in 2012, and I think, or early, or 2009, a nice round number that has a divisible of 3 in it, which is how I remember numbers. And they make that case to be like, hey, when you include more Indigenous people in your syllabus, that's not decolonization. That's not crappy, but it's not decolonization. So that's an early and often sort of message. And before we hand it back to Dr. Hernandez, I also wanted to note that you say, oh, I think I have insights into your personal life. You do not. I am very careful in my book to keep it professional. So actually, Dr. Hernandez and I have very different approaches. Like you said, there is autoethnography in my book, the telling of stories through experience, but I still steer very, very clear from my personal and familial life, because I only tell stories I've been asked to tell. And my family is so far flung and reconnecting and these sorts of stuff that I don't actually have permission to sell those stories. And also, I don't think it's anyone's business. So everything coming out of that book, even if it uses autoethnography out of my life or lab members' lives, it's in the service of professional knowledge, whether that's what Hernandez might call Indigenous science or anti-colonial science or Western science or a mix-up of it. Because I feel very strongly methodologically that constantly giving people, non-Indigenous people, access to Indigenous life worlds is like not an awesome trend. It's actually a cause of a lot of harm, right? And so I made it, but storytelling is also a major form of Indigenous method. So I did a decision very early on in the book that I was like, I am not going to use that method. That is a legit method because it gets fetishized so often. I'm going to go this other route instead. So that's part of why I really like the pairing of these two books, is they use very different approaches, but we agree on everything, right? There's very deep resonance, even though we have very fundamentally different approaches, technically and in sort of writerly way.
Thank you so much for your answer. I had noticed that as well when I was reading both of your works together, is there's agreement and parallels, and the style is also different in the ways that you had described. And my next question actually has to do with how they are related to each other. And you two can, even if we want to have a conversation with each other as you're answering those questions, go for it. Actually, I'm noticing someone in the chat is asking, is there a chance for both presenters to talk a little bit about their books before some of the specific questions I want to ask today? Is there anything that either of you want to share generally about what inspired you to write this book, or what's important for you to share today at this point in our chat?
You go first.
Okay. So I think one of the things that inspired me to write this book is because, I have a Western education in climate science and environmental sciences, but yet when it came to looking for Indigenous perspectives, especially the Indigenous voices from south of the border, they were nowhere to be found. And I think that, as someone who is working with the International Mayan League and seeing how a lot of our Indigenous relatives are still facing displacement, like forced displacement, because oftentimes it's not a choice from south of the border, and then when they're either entering the settler governments of the United States or Canada, which are all indigenous lands, they're met with this kind of xenophobia and these colonial languages that many of our people don't speak, whether that be Spanish or English. And I think that for me, one of the duties of coming from a matriarchal society is that, as someone who's going to become a matriarch, is to continue uplifting the voices, especially of our indigenous women and youth, as we continue to experience the impacts of climate change. And I think that, it was always something that I wanted to kind of tell my father's story, because, when we look at the Central American Civil War, it's told from a different lens, right? It has never in a way grounded it on the Indigenous children's perspective. It has always grounded it on whether, more of the adults, the non-Indigenous adults of that time period, the government, and also from a outsider's gaze. So I think that, it was ultimately something that I was interested in doing for my future generations, for myself, and was asked to do so by my community members, especially, as there was a lot of translation, right from our native languages to Spanish and then to English, which is the final colonial language that the text came out in.
Thank you so much for your beautiful answer.
Yeah, so a very different seed for my work, even though I think our books grow in very similar directions. So my book is an academic text, and that's it, what it is. And if it's a bit outside the usual genre of like jargon elite, pale, male, and stale, whatever academic texts often are, that's still what it is. And so the seeds for my book do come out of like research questions and research settings, first and foremost ish. So two different things were happening at the same time in my professional life. One was I was researching plastic pollution at a time when it was just being recognized as a scientific problem, not yet even an environmental problem. So this was a little while ago. And I really thought that because plastic pollution doesn't assimilate into the environment, it becomes more dangerous as it breaks down. It enables life and harm at the same time. The chemicals associated with cause the highest harm at the lowest doses, which flies in the face of toxicologies, the dangers in the dose. I really thought there'd be a paradigm shift in pollution because plastics were so unique in how they polluted. And there wasn't one. And I couldn't understand why like plastics yelling how they were different was not being heard in the scientific community. And then just after that, I came to Newfoundland and Labrador and got a job and was about to run my own science lab. And I didn't want to reproduce a lot of the norms of Western science: individualism, elitism, mastery over nature, teacher knows all, right? All of these sorts of things. And so I was looking to do science in a very, very different way. And these two things came together. I came to understand over colonialism and anti-colonialism. So I came to understand like the way that pollution was understood actually had to do with colonial land relations, not just capitalist or industry land relations, but this idea that settlers and industry and settler governments, the settler state felt the right to use land as a sink. And that was actually the premise of all regulation and even environmental activism and this sort of stuff. And I was like, oh, well, so that's why it didn't change, because if plastics can still be stored in the earth, you can still use land as your sink and do your dirty laundry. So that was actually never actually challenged. So that's why it didn't change. And also, I could locate a lot of the harms of Western science culturally in lab culture and knowledge production, also in those same land relations, this entitlement to land for research, because that's good. And be like, so I started to be able to articulate these very different things in terms of colonial land relations, and therefore what would not that look like? Not just Indigenous land relations, which are also anti-colonial, but also queer land relations and abolitionist land relations, and these other ones that also aren't colonial, but aren't also actually Indigenous, because especially here in Newfoundland and Labrador, non-Indigenous people are always going to be part of my lab, always going to be part of my professional life. So how do I figure out making room for that sort of stuff? So very different sort of paths into these books, even though they end up having a lot of agreement, because the premises are still true, right? Like abuse of land and abuse of Indigenous people is the same abuse. And the way you do things and your orientations as method and as spirit are actually the same thing. And the books totally agree on those points, even though we sort of weave different stories in.
Thank you both so much for your clear and connected answers. And that is actually, Dr. Liboiron, you kind of already answered what I was going to ask. And so maybe this is a good segue for Dr. Hernandez to kind of respond to what you had just said. But I had noticed that a common central topic in both of your works is that Indigenous knowledge is centered through the experience and knowledge of a place and land across time. That was my interpretation, shared through storytelling. That's something that Dr. Hernandez acknowledges pretty explicitly in her book, rather than through formal social structures like learning in a university, for example. That's on page 109 in Fresh Banana Leaves. And in a footnote on page 7, Dr. Liboiron defines land as a unique entity that is the combined living spirit of plants, animals, air, water, humans, histories, and events recognized by many Indigenous communities. And you kind of already spoke a bit about that. And so what this empowers in me is that people can become experts on themselves and their environments through their lived experiences, instead of offshooting all that power to an elite group of people. And this disrupts common power structures that a lot of us learn growing up. And so I think Dr. Liboiron, you already spoke to this a bit, but please feel free to expand. I'm wondering can you give an early example of when you knew this truth inside of you? Yeah, you both know how to explain it intellectually, but I'm wondering, either from your book or a memory from your younger life, when did you know this? When did you know that this was the definition of land and this is how the world connected for you? How early were you tracking that?
So again, my personal life is nobody's business, and it's not going to happen in the book, and it's not going to happen here. But what I can say is that like doing a definition of land like that, like here is the beginning of definition of land, and here's the end of it, and here's a period, is actually really cheeky. And it's not the most Indigenous methodology on the planet. But and actually, I'd really like to hear how Jessica also dealt with this. So when you write a book, you do some stuff that is real cheeky, like you make statements about the world in a way that really elders are only supposed to do. You make connections that may or may not be yours to really make. So academics do this all the time, and this is what you're supposed to do when you write a book. But if you're not an elder being like, here's what Indigenous people are like, oh my God, I mean, I could get slapped for that. But it's what also a book sort of demands. And so as an author, and I think this also speaks to a whole range of methods that I think some people can see on the page and some people can't, but I'd be really interested in hearing how Dr. Hernandez dealt with them, like balancing between, say, talking to an audience that's Indigenous, because even Jessica, in your book, you say like, I want this to be used for Indigenous people, but then other times you're literally addressing white settlers being like, point 1, how are you a racist? Figure it out. Point 2, stop it, right? Like that's not for an Indigenous. So you're talking to two fundamentally different audiences at the same time, which requires some finesse. You're sharing stories that are being brought to the edge of cheekiness based on community norms and protocols. You're sharing stories that you need permission to share. And so that's part of land. That is a land relation, right? So, and you learn that in my experience, you don't learn that, it doesn't well up in yourself. You learn it through community. You learn it from people teasing you when you got it wrong, maybe from slaps if you got it really wrong and it's that particular auntie. You learn it through jokes. You learn it through the elder sitting you down and saying the exact same thing he said last time, and you're like, wait, I thought I got that, but given that he's saying it to you for the third time, you probably didn't get it. That's how you learn land. So I don't have many professional or personal experiences of it welling up inside me as a truth. I have a lot more experiences getting teased and being brought into line in community. And so that methodology, I think, carries into the pages of at least my book, all the footnotes, all the learning, all the discussion of mistakes, all the like bare bones of why I chose this way and not that way, because I don't think it wells up inside of me as a truth. I think it comes up to me from all sides in a cacophony. And I'm most of the time incorrect. So.
You sound like a true scientist. Thank you so much for your answer. Dr. Hernandez, what is your response?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think oftentimes one of the things that I kind of connected to is the displacement, right? That I have faced, that my family has faced, especially from, beyond settler borders. And I think that my nation is unique, right? Because we follow a matriarchal society where women have the authority, where women are not necessarily have to become elders for them to tell their stories or share the stories that their communities have, because it's the matriarchy society that we follow, which is very distinct from patriarchy, which is almost every other place outside of my nation. So even growing up, it was kind of unique to kind of live in this matriarchal society, which kind of seems like a utopia, especially if you are accustomed to the patriarchy society. And I think that one of the things that I do face a lot, especially critiques, is that there is no Indigenous science that was shared so that people can actually heal their Indigenous landscapes. And I think that, that's where I drew the line, where I wasn't going to share the Indigenous science that has been co-opted from my communities, from other Indigenous communities. And I think that the ways that I shared the stories was to make people reflect, so that it didn't necessarily tell, give them a guidebook on, oh, this is how we're going to use traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous science to actually, implement it in our grants, to do continue more research without including the Indigenous peoples. And I think that, it was a line that I had to follow. I had to ask, my elders. So this kind of book kind of like took over 3 years to develop, because, I also have read so many books about the Zapotec Nation, or I mean, not books, but yeah, books also, in peer review articles that talk about our matriarchal society that are written by a non-Indigenous person, or sometimes other Indigenous peoples that don't necessarily have a strong relationship with our communities. So they have been, they provide false information. Obviously, someone who can read, Spanish and English, especially in English, sometimes I get articles on the Zapotec Nation and talking about the matriarchal society, and it's like completely wrong. But how do you address that, especially given that there's so many colonial languages that are serve as barriers for our communities? And I think that one of the premises was to ground that matriarchy that we have, and ground those Indigenous women's perspectives and stories without sharing parts of their Indigenous science that we have seen often time by time be co-opted, like for instance permaculture, horticulture, some methods using gardening have been Indigenous knowledge that has been co-opted in a way that has been packaged for the Western consumption into boxes, right, into fields of studies, into certificates that you can gain after you pay like hundreds of dollars, but yet there's no reciprocal relationship with the Indigenous peoples or the lands that that knowledge came from. So I think that it was a balancing act, and I think that this book, one of the reasons why I wanted it to be written for Indigenous scholars was that there's often times when we're the only Indigenous person in many spaces, and as a result we have to do all the teaching, right? Like sometimes it's hard for us to remove ourselves from the teaching into taking action, because we constantly have to teach non-Indigenous peoples how to do this the proper way, how to do it respectfully. And I think that hopefully if scholars like myself, I wish I had books like Dr. Max's, and also, other books, Indigenous books, to kind of share as I was going through graduate school, because, it was that constant teaching that we had to do on knowledge that for us was normalized, on, norms that should be respected from the beginning. And I think that, hopefully, Indigenous books, especially the ones that are coming forward as we, move into our generations, and the work that we have to do, continue to kind of address those barriers that continue to put us in that teaching role, as opposed to the researcher role. That because sometimes we just want to do research, sometimes we just want to take the action and not be always on the teaching side of things. So hopefully that answered the question. Thank you.
I'm really glad that you brought up refusal, and that a primary critique of your book is that you don't actually be like, oh, and here's the Indigenous science for you, after you spend the whole book talking about like, it has to be related to land, it's place-based, it comes out of our histories, it comes out of our diasporas, it comes out of this, it has to come out of obligations. Okay, give it to me. Did you not just hear what I said? Like, I can't give it to you. That's not how this works. And so I do something very similar, is that I don't give any Indigenous science either. We talk about anti-colonial science, which can be taken up by anyone who doesn't want to reproduce colonialism, but people don't get the Indigenous science. So sometimes people, same sort of stuff, being like, well, does this mean you don't do Indigenous science? I'm like, we do it, and it's none of your business. Right. And if I have Inuit folks in my lab, it's none of my business, actually, because I'm not Inuit and I'm not from certain places where I do research stuff. And so definitely one of the Indigenous methods that we definitely have in common is this refusal, deeply ethical. Like, to be fully generous, you need good boundaries. And so I think one of the things that's true of both of our books is that they're very generous, but only because we have hard stops where they need to, and you can fill up everything up until then. And you don't get to fetishize or own or appropriate or take any of that. And I'm glad you brought up the Zapotec thing, actually, because I got a book. I ordered it off its title. It was something like Zapotec Science. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited. And I started reading it. And I was like, oh, damn, this is by a white dude anthropologist. And I just put it down because I knew it would not be, that it was either stolen or not be accurate, or wasn't, like, there's no way, there was no co-authors, there was no introduction. I was like, okay, this is not, and it's just sitting on my shelf. And I never got past like page 10, and I don't need to. But I read your whole book from beginning to end, and probably learned more about Zapotec science than I would from that book, which is all about farming, mostly, by the looks of the pictures.
Thank you so much. I'm really tracking that in both of y'all's answers and perspectives, so that you're both really grounded in your integrity and your boundaries. And I think with that protection that is required in doing this kind of work, it adds another layer onto this discussion, because of history, for lack of a better explanation, but because of everything that both of y'all just explained so well. And so I wanna, before we get into other people's questions, I wanna try to end on a note of resilience if it's possible. And if you're feeling that right now, my question is kind of simple, and that's, what's giving you hope right now? And is there any movement, cause, person, feeling that you want to uplift to us right now and tell the audience about?
Well, there's an international land back movement. That's like the movement. Rematriating and repatriating land and life. When you rematriate land, you rematriate life. And that doesn't always mean forking over your acreage, although it definitely includes forking over your acreage. It also includes allowing Indigenous people to govern their lands again, because that's also part of land back, even if it's shared, especially when it's shared, actually. There's a lot of sharing protocol in Red River Métis culture. It's actually one of our founding orienting sort of values and principles. So it doesn't always, although sometimes does, mean the leaving of other folks. But yeah, land back. Hashtag, if you put hashtag land back, it'll take you all sorts of places that you need to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, I'm often asked this question, like, what gives me hope? And the common answer that we always get is the youth, right? But I think that as the youth, as somebody who I would say I speak for the youth. We're tired too, right? We don't want to do all the work that, and I think that what gives me hope is just knowing that more Indigenous women and queer folks and LGBTQ are kind of taking leadership roles because, in my Zapotec community, we also have a third gender known as the Muses. And for so long, we had to battle to prevent that, that religious kind of doctrination to, infiltrate our communities where, there's a lot of anti-LGBTQ and a lot of anti-queer kind of like doctrines that kind of governed, religion, Western religion. And I think that, being able to say that my Indigenous community still follow the matriarchal society where we still honor and respect our third gender is something that gives me hope because, for so long we have faced assimilation, we have faced a lot of, genocides, a lot of like bad things as Max will say, but there's also the kind of like the hope that we have prevailed all of that. So I think that it gives me hope, right? In that sense. I don't know if that if that makes sense.
Thank you both so much for your answers. And the depth to which you explain things, I can keep on thinking about it. And so we want to take some time to transition into some of the questions that people were posting in the chat. And so at this point, we will not be recording the discussion. So just want to make sure that whomever is our tech host today, please turn